Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Angel DeSantis. I am a religious trauma counselor and a yoga teacher, and welcome. I'm going to talk today about religious trauma as it relates to sex and disgust. So if that's something that you're interested in, stick around. I have to put a trigger warning right at the top. I am going to talk about a lot of different things. I grew up personally in a religious cult and have experienced a lot of abuse, and I experienced abuse as a child. So if that is something that is triggering for you and you don't have the capacity right now to absorb it, then please go ahead and push pause on this or skip it altogether. But I want to put that at the top because it will be something that I will discuss. And if this is your first video with me, welcome. If this is your second or third time, go ahead and hit the like button and hit subscribe, ring the little bell to get notifications. But mostly welcome. Thank you for being here. This is a new thing for me. I have a bunch of notes. I researched and typed it up because I feel like religious trauma is something that isn't really talked about. And for me, I grew up in a religious cult, and then coming out of that and thinking that I was wrong and that I was gross and flawed. As I went through my healing journey, I realized that there is always a reason for you feeling the way that you do. So it's not that you're flawed or you're made wrong. You are not the thing that is imperfect. You might have had a childhood experience that was imperfect or experienced trauma, but there is always a reason, and there's a way for you to understand what it is that you're going through. So I just wanted to share my experiences and my research and talk about the things that I have been able to make sense so that I can heal and move through them. And I wanted to come on here and share that with you. So welcome, welcome. I'm gonna start with religion's view on sex, which starts, this is specifically, by the way, as it pertains to Christianity, because that is what I'm familiar with. So that is what I'm going with. That's what I know. So religion's view on sex generally starts with the virgin birth. And what is implied in the virgin birth is that Jesus is pure and Jesus is wonderful and clean and pure because he didn't come from sex. And that's not explicitly stated, but the fact that they're like, no, she's a virgin. He came from God through somebody who had never had sex before. The subtext of that is that sex is kind of gross and you don't want to have it if you want to be pure. And that is like where it starts. It starts there. It starts with Mary being super pure because she hadn't had sex. And Jesus is lovely because he wasn't made the gross human way. He's divine. So there's that. It starts with sex being gross. So you may have found another way, or you may have been part of another religion that didn't do that. And then the cult that I was in was a sex cult. So they actually didn't give us that story. They gave us the story that like the archangel Gabriel came down and like actually fully had sex with Mary and she loved it. And then she gave birth to Jesus because obviously the teaching that I got was a little off. But I think the whole view of religion's view of sex is generally suppressive. And religious trauma's whole message is generally suppression of self. So depending on what time in your childhood development that you started coming across sex, if you grew up in a place that was really religious, mostly I feel like religion's messaging about sex is that it's disgusting and you shouldn't do it. And that is meant to give you the suppression of your sexual self so that they can better, so that they can better control your urges or, make you feel some type of way about yourself that is not empowering. So I want to talk about disgust, because if you had that experience where somebody told you that sex was disgusting, and now that you are an adult, you might wonder why you did think sex was disgusting. So I want to talk about disgust and where it comes from. And this is some stuff that I pulled from the NCBI, which is the National Center for Biotechnology Information Advances in Science and Health, by providing, and they provide access to biomedical and genomic information. Genomic? Anyways, it's from them. And this says, disgust is the primary means by which human individuals detect and avoid infectious pathogens. Disgust has a protective quality. Think about the things that you find disgusting. We feel disgust in our bodies, and it actually raises our body's temperatures and wants us to get away from the things we find disgusting, and it is actually a boundary circuit. Although disgust plays a key role in protecting us from disease, it is also responsible for much human suffering. Several authors have made a start on unpicking the nature of the relationship. Is disgust the exaction of an ancient system designed to distance ourselves from parasites, turned to the function of ostracizing social parasites? And how I understand that is that you find things disgusting, like if you see a pile of goo that's that's disgusting, and you automatically feel that in your body because it's a defense mechanism and you don't go towards that pile of crap or whatever it is. And then they were saying it has also evolved, has it evolved to be a boundary system so that we also distance ourselves from social parasites. And it continues, disgust is a voice in our heads. It's the voice of our ancestors telling us to avoid infectious disease and social parasites. It's the voice of emotion, and it is there for a reason. It guides us to behave in ways that are good for our genes, or more precisely, to behave in the way that were good for the genes of our ancestors. So that's interesting. That's a little bit about disgust. And now I want to talk about the timing of when you are introduced to sex being gross. Because again, disgust is a natural thing. It's supposed to be there. It's supposed to be in us. It is not supposed to be used against us, though. And depending on when you were introduced to sex, it will maybe have bound together with being disgusting, especially if that is what you were taught. So the thing that I hear the most from people who have grown up in really religious environments is that their parents caught them masturbating, or they asked their parents a question, or they started to explore it, and they were met with the message that that's disgusting. Don't touch yourself. Don't let anybody touch you there. That's gross. And then you internalize that, and you also feel it because disgust is inside of you, because it's supposed to be a barrier there, so that you don't explore things that you are not supposed to. Disgust is inside of you, and it's there to keep you safe. So that's a normal, natural thing. But the thing where it gets messed up is where you feel personally that your sex or your sexual persona or whatever it is, you feel like that's disgusting, and that part of you is disgusting. So let me see. It says, in moments of trauma, and this is from a wonderful woman called Sarah Payton. I will link her because she's amazing. And she says, in moments of trauma, there is a wiring together of the experience of danger or life threat and whatever else is happening. So if you are exploring yourself and somebody or whatever, you get caught, and the person who is telling you, don't do that, that's gross. The other thing that generally happens that I've heard is that they tell you, God's watching, and you don't want God to think you're disgusting, and God, Jesus is going to watch you masturbating. And so you have the threat of hell, or the fear of hell, if you touch yourself. And then those two things get glued together. So it says sexuality and fear can get glued together in trauma. So after we move through it as a grown-up, we find that there's nothing there to sex or after sex but fear and shame. And we do not have a original sexual self. It is all a coping mechanism. So there's a lot to unpack, but I think it's really important to understand that if you are, whatever age you are, there's a very natural progression of human development. And if you think of a 5-year-old or something, when you see somebody kissing, that's disgusting. When you're a 5-year-old and you see someone's tongue, that's vile. You think it's gross, and that's good, because that is the boundary mechanism that you are supposed to have, because you are not supposed to be finding out anything about a sexual self. That is there as a boundary that is not supposed to be developed at that age. But if when you do start to explore it, you have somebody come in and tie your curiosity about sex to being disgust, then those two things can bond together in your brain. And then as you grow up and you start to develop, first of all, why would you develop something that's disgusting? And even if you do, then you would always feel this sort of shame around it, because that's the thing that was fused together in that moment of trauma when someone came in and said, you know, don't do that, God's watching. And like, if you masturbate, you go to hell, which is literally things that people tell you, which is, if you don't know, it is not true. Now you know, I've told you. And then the other thing that happens, and this is where the trigger warning goes into effect, is I know a lot of people personally, and I was too, and I know a lot of people who also have been involved in the church who were abused as children sexually, and then told not to tell with the same threat of hell. So it was somebody in the church who abused you and then threatened God and threatened hell to silence you. And the thing that gets bound up there is like massive fear, obviously, massive disgust, massive shame, and sexual trauma. And when you lump that all together, it can be really, really difficult to sort through. And again, religious trauma as well. It's the suppression, it's the don't tell anybody. And then how can you even tell anybody about this thing that's so like jumbled up, and you can feel again like you are the problem and that you are the thing that is disgusting, and you are not the thing that is disgusting, but you feel that way for a reason. And that's why it's so important to understand all these moments of development in the brain and all these moments of everything getting wired together and getting stuck, because then when you understand that, it is easier to allow it to become unstuck. So this is continuing with Sarah Payton. She says, when children are sexually abused, it awakens the sexuality circuit before it's meant to be awakened. A lot of times puberty will start early in children who have been sexually abused. We don't get to touch ourselves as innocent emergence. There is an overlay of trauma which stunts the growth. Sex and intimacy are supposed to grow together. Sex and disgust towards yourself are not meant to grow together. You are not disgusting. I know somebody, and I feel like this is a really interesting case, but typical. And he was abused as a child, and he was not able to undo the sex and disgust. They locked together for obvious reasons, because they were both present at the time when sex was introduced. There was fear, there was trauma, there was disgust. They all bonded together. And he went on to try and heal the best that he could. And he eventually got married, had a wife, but he couldn't separate sex being disgusting. It was still disgusting. And as much as he wanted to be with this person who was his wife, who he loved, he couldn't undo those two. And so she felt that she was disgusting because he couldn't enjoy her, because he thought sex was disgusting, but he loved her. And it was just this this moment that was very, very heavy for both of them in their marriage, which is, I think, typical. But again, if you don't know where these things come from, it can turn into something like that, where you both kind of don't know where it comes from, and you are both negatively affected because of all the things that bound together in that moment of the combination of sexual abuse and religious trauma and suppression and fear all happening at once to a very young brain. So again, it is not his fault, because abuse is never your fault, but unfortunately, he does now bear the responsibility of having to undo all of this internally in order to have a successful marriage. And it is a very heavy burden to bear. But this was a couple of years ago, and he has been doing work since then on himself, which is, again, a very lovely thing to do. Everyone go to therapy. And he's been working really hard, and they have been able to move through it in a healthy way, but it does take a long time. It is a lot, because all of these things should not have been looped together. And then Sarah Payton ends with this beautiful line. You have a sexual personality that is not compromised by trauma. You just have to go find it. So, and then I have my notes. And I know for a lot of people, again, when you've experienced heavy abuse as a kid, sex is already gross. And then when you are abused, abuse is gross. And you can think that the problem is you, because why would they have done it to you if you weren't the disgusting thing? And you feel that internally because you do feel the disgust, which again was meant to be there to be a boundary, but somebody crossed your boundary. So it's important to remember that you do enter the world with everything that you need. So you needed all that stuff inside of you. Fear is healthy. Fear helps you just be aware of where you are. Fear is a good thing. Disgust is a good thing. Anger is a good thing. Sexuality is a good thing. It's not good for them all to lump together in the form of abuse. But it's important to understand that disgust was there because it was supposed to protect you. And I think that's the main thing of understanding that feeling that you may feel if you've been in that moment of being abused, especially by an authoritative figure with the authority of God. You might feel like you are the problem, and then you end up thinking that you're disgusting, and you end up with a very devastating moral injury around the subject of sex. So sex can become completely detached from intimacy, and it can become a performance to receive approval and allow you to feel like you belong and lessen your worry of abandonment. Because at the end of the day, all human beings have the need for attachment, and our fear is non-attachment, is not being able to survive because you're not attached to anything, and fear of being abandoned and being alone. So if you are able to pull apart sex and intimacy, which should be linked, if you're able to pull it apart, then you can end up just performing sex as an act of searching for belonging, as opposed to what it was meant to be, which is an intimate experience from two fully formed sexual beings with their own sexual personality that is compatible. So this next one is from the dissertation work of Dr. Noel Clarke at Seattle Pacific University. And he says, and this is talking about sexual shame, he says, sexual shame is a visceral feeling of humiliation and disgust towards one's own body and identity as a sexual being, and a belief of being abnormal, inferior, and unworthy. This feeling can be internalized, but also manifests in interpersonal relationships, having a negative impact on trust, communication, and physical and emotional intimacy. Sexual shame develops across the lifespan in interactions with personal relationship, one's culture and society, and subsequent critical self-appraisal. There is also a fear and uncertainty related to one's power or right to make decisions, including safety decisions related to sexual encounters, along with an internalized judgment towards one's own sexual desire. So, all the things, all the time. And I haven't even touched on the religious view of other sexuality, because a lot of times the traditional Christian value is a man and a woman in a very male, generally misogynistic role, and then a woman in a very subservient, feminine, and they usually correlate it to a weak role. And it's a man and a woman together, and that's the only acceptable form of sexuality, and everything else is disgusting. And again, if you grew up, not even with abuse, but if you grew up gay or with just a different sexual expression than the matriarchal and patriarchal sexual identities that you are allowed to have within the structure of religion, then again, you can feel like you are the problem, as opposed to the fact that what the real problem is the idea that there is just one way to be sexual, and it's the way that the church dictates, which is so wildly inappropriate that I just don't feel like I need to delve into it that much, because sexuality, again, is a personal thing. You have a personal sexual identity that is untouched by trauma, that you can still discover, and it's yours. It is no one else's. It doesn't belong to anyone else. And that's important. It certainly doesn't belong to the church. Okay, so I'm going to end with shame. If you feel like you are disgusting, then you can feel like you're not worthy of love. That's not a big leap to make. If you feel like you are flawed and you're gross and you're disgusting, it's not a big leap to go from that to feeling really shameful of yourself and really shameful of your wants and desires, and having, again, all those things bound up together that should not be bound up together. But being unable to suss it out, you might just feel like, you know what, I'm the problem, forget it. Let me not look at it, let me not express it. I'm the problem. And you are not the problem. You're never the problem. So the shame that you carry around, whether it's from how your sexual persona has emerged or hasn't emerged, or if it's shame from an abuse from your past, that shame is not yours to carry. And my hope in talking about this and talking about the brain developments and patterns and stuff like that is that you understand that there is a reason why you feel these things. Again, there's a reason why you feel disgust. It was supposed to be a boundary. There's a reason why you feel fear. It's supposed to keep you safe. There's a reason why you feel pleasure during sex. All of these things have a correct reason. Like, they are developed in you biologically. They're supposed to be there, but when they all become enmeshed, that is when it becomes really confusing. So it's important for you to understand that you do not have to bear the shame for any of your abuses or any of your suppression that was tried to be passed down to you, but you do bear the responsibility to find out about the parts of you that deserve to be fully alive. So I'm ending this by inviting you to find the root of the problem, because there is always a reason why you feel the things that you feel, but you are not the problem. I invite you to care enough about yourself to understand where things are coming from inside of you, because it is coming from somewhere. But the thing that you must remember is that you are not the problem. So things stay the same until you are willing to look at them. And whether or not you are conscious of the problem, or if it's all still stuck in your subconscious, there's stuff there. And I think it's really important for you to give yourself permission to understand that, one, you are not the problem, and two, there's a reason why you feel the way that you do. So I usually always like to end these with a question. And my question for you is asking you how you feel about your sexual self. Do you feel like there is one that you can develop in a healthy way without shame? Because that is a part of yourself, and that is, again, a part that deserves to be alive. If you grew up in a very religious household, they will have tried to suppress it. And it doesn't deserve to be suppressed. It deserves to be alive. There's a healthy way to do it. When you suppress a thing, that's when it goes wrong. That's when eventually it blows the lid off and it comes out in a very ugly way, which is why abuse is cyclical, which is why you have all these abuses in the church. Like, the church is the thing that is full of these sexual abuses, because they use, again, that combination of understanding that you will feel disgust and you will feel shame, and then they wield the power of God against you so that they can continue these abuses. And the reason why these abuses has come up over and over again is because they keep suppressing it. So when you suppress a thing, it will still show up. It'll just show up in a really skewed way. So ignoring the problem is never the answer. So if there is, again, anything that I leave you with today, it's to understand, to encourage you to understand where these things are coming from inside of you, and to ask you if you have given yourself permission to find your sexual self, because that is an important thing. That is something that might have been literally or figuratively beaten out of you. But again, suppression always makes whatever it is uglier. So give yourself permission to sit down and look at these things. Look at the development of your brain. There is so much that makes so much sense when you start to look at the brain. So I invite you to do that. Again, I hope this was helpful. If you have questions, ask me questions. I do work with people who have experienced religious trauma. I have a methodology of working through it. So if you're interested, let me know. Otherwise, thank you for listening. Again, drop a comment below if you have any questions or if it's been helpful. I welcome feedback because I want to understand how people experience the things that I have to offer. So thank you guys for being with me this long. Thank you for listening. Let me know how I can help, and I'll see you guys next time.